She cared for her paralyzed millionaire husband for 10 years. Then one night, she received a gift he never expected. This is one of my most powerful love stories. Don't miss Chapter 9. It will touch your heart and satisfy your soul. Hi, my beautiful family. First, let me lift a prayer for you. May the light of God always guide your path. May love never leave your home. And may your heart be filled with peace, joy, and strength every single day. Family, I have created something very special for you. A new channel called Mr. Peter Family. This channel is not just about stories. It is about us. About love. About staying together as one. It is a second home where every word is filled with emotion, every story is made with care, and every moment is built only for you, my beautiful family. You can find the channel link in my community post. I truly need you with me there, because your love is my strength, your support is my hope, and without you, nothing is complete. If your heart is true, write present. If your love is real, write I am with Mr. Peter. Together, we are not just a channel. We are a family forever. In the heartbeat between love and destruction, heroes are born and hearts are shattered forever. The screeching of tires echoed through the Manhattan Canyon of glass and steel as Landon Donovan watched his worst nightmare unfold in slow motion. Alex Thompson's silver BMW careened down the steep hill toward Fifth Avenue. Her brakes clearly failed, heading straight for the concrete barrier that separated the road from a 100-foot drop into the Hudson River. Time suspended itself in that crystalline moment of choice. Landon could have swerved away, could have saved himself, could have watched the woman who had once been his wife disappear forever into the churning waters below. Instead, love made the decision for him. Without hesitation, Landon gunned his black Porsche and rammed into the side of her car with devastating force, sending it spinning safely into a parked delivery truck instead of over the edge. The impact sent his own vehicle tumbling like a metallic avalanche, flipping 3 times before crashing into the limestone wall of the Chrysler Building's base with a sound like thunder splitting the earth. Glass showered the street like deadly snow. Steam hissed from twisted metal. Sirens wailed their urgent song through the concrete jungle as emergency responders raced against time. Paramedics worked frantically to extract Landon from the twisted wreckage, their faces grim as they stabilized his broken body on a stretcher that would carry him toward a destiny he never could have imagined. The irony was bitter as poison. Alex emerged from her crash with nothing more than superficial scratches and a mild concussion, while the man who had saved her lay fighting for his life with a severed spinal cord and internal injuries that threatened to claim him entirely. When Landon opened his eyes in Mount Sinai Hospital after drifting in unconsciousness for 3 agonizing days, Alex Thompson was sitting beside his bed, tears streaming down her perfectly sculpted face. She looked like a broken angel, her designer clothes wrinkled and stained, her platinum hair disheveled for perhaps the first time in their entire tumultuous relationship. "Landon, oh God, what have you done?" she whispered, gripping his hand with fingers that trembled like autumn leaves caught in a fierce wind. He tried to move his legs. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The absence of sensation was more terrifying than any pain could have been. Dr. Rodriguez's words floated back to him through the morphine haze like fragments of a nightmare. Complete spinal cord injury at the 12th thoracic vertebra, permanent paralysis below the waist. I'm deeply sorry, Mr. Donovan. Your heroic sacrifice saved Mrs. Thompson's life, but the cost has been devastating and irreversible. You saved my life, Alex continued, her voice breaking with what seemed like genuine anguish. I'll never leave you. Never. We'll get through this together, my darling. I promise you that on everything I hold sacred in this world. The hospital room became their temporary sanctuary for the next 8 weeks. Alex transformed herself into the picture of devoted care, sleeping in the uncomfortable reclining chair that left her back aching each morning, feeding him when his hands shook too badly to hold a spoon, reading to him from financial newspapers when staring at the ceiling became too depressing to bear. She learned the names of every nurse, charmed every doctor with her grace under pressure, and created the illusion of a love story so beautiful that even the cynical hospital staff found themselves believing in second chances and redemptive romance. "She never leaves his side," whispered Nurse Patricia to her colleague during the night shift. "Even when he's sleeping, she just sits there watching him breathe. That's real love right there." Alex made sure to time her most touching displays of affection for when the medical staff was watching. She would stroke his forehead tenderly during doctor visits, speak passionately about their future together during therapy consultations, and shed perfectly timed tears when discussing the challenges ahead. Every gesture was calculated to build the narrative of a love reborn through tragedy. For the next 6 months after his release to a rehabilitation facility on the Upper East Side, she played the part of the devoted ex-wife turned caregiver with Academy Award precision. She attended every grueling physical therapy session, holding his hand as he struggled to master basic wheelchair maneuvers that healthy people accomplished without thought. She held his head when the depression hit like a tsunami, whispering promises of their rekindled future together while privately calculating how much longer she needed to maintain this charade. She slept in the bedroom of his rehabilitation suite, claiming she couldn't bear to be apart from him after nearly losing him forever to death. "We were divorced, but that was just paper," she would tell the other patients' families with convincing sincerity. "Real love doesn't die because of legal documents. Landon proved that when he chose to save me instead of himself. Landon believed every word, every gesture, every tear. He clung to her love as his only anchor in a world that had suddenly become impossibly small and frighteningly uncertain. When she suggested they remarry in a beautiful ceremony, she began planning with meticulous detail. He wept with joy, thinking his sacrifice had finally earned him the love he'd always craved from her. The proposal was orchestrated with theatrical precision in the rehabilitation center's rooftop garden, surrounded by roses she claimed to have grown herself but had actually purchased from an expensive florist. "You've shown me what true love means," she declared, sliding a modest ring onto his finger. Modest, because she was already planning to keep the expensive jewelry for herself. "I want to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of the sacrifice you made for me." But Alex Thompson was nothing if not calculating, and her heart was as cold as Arctic steel beneath her warm facade of rekindled devotion. While he slept, exhausted from therapy sessions that left him drained both physically and emotionally, she met with Christopher Hayes and their team of lawyers in downtown offices, crafting her escape plan with meticulous precision. Christopher had been her secret lover, even during her original marriage to Landon, waiting patiently for the right opportunity to claim both the woman and the fortune he'd always coveted. While Landon struggled to regain basic motor functions and adjust to his new reality with admirable determination, she systematically transferred assets from accounts he could no longer monitor effectively. While he planned their future together, sketching out modifications for their penthouse to accommodate his wheelchair and dreaming of the children they might adopt, she planned her disappearance with the methodical patience of a spider weaving its web around a trusting fly. The papers she had him sign were masterfully disguised legal traps. "Insurance paperwork," she called them, kissing his forehead tenderly as he scrawled his signature with hands that still shook from medication. "The lawyers say we need these to protect us from liability claims related to the accident and to ensure your medical care is always covered." In reality, they were power of attorney documents that gave her complete control over his financial empire, documents that would allow her to liquidate everything he'd spent his life building. The medical expense transactions she showed him monthly were actually transfers to offshore accounts she'd established in preparation for her escape. The specialist consultation fees were actually payments to Christopher Hayes, not for medical expertise, but for his role as her accomplice in the most elaborate theft of both heart and fortune ever conceived. During those deceptive months of false hope and manufactured intimacy, Alex played her role with masterful precision that would have impressed professional actresses. She learned medical terminology to discuss his condition intelligently with doctors, researched adaptive equipment to help him maintain independence, and even suggested they start a foundation for spinal cord research, knowing it would never come to pass, but enjoying the way his face lit up at the possibility of turning his tragedy into something meaningful for other families facing similar challenges. The morning she disappeared, Landon found only a note written on expensive hotel stationery, placed precisely in the center of his nightstand, where he couldn't possibly miss it. "I can't live like this anymore. I tried to love you the way you deserve, but I need a real life with a man who can give me everything I've always dreamed of. I'm sorry it has to end this way, but some sacrifices are just too great to sustain forever. A." By noon, when his loyal assistant Michael called in a panic from their office, Landon discovered the full scope of her calculated betrayal. Every investment portfolio, liquidated at significant losses due to rushed transactions. Every property, sold below market value to buyers Christopher had arranged in advance. Every bank account, drained except for a small trust fund his grandfather had established with ironclad legal protections even Alex's team of lawyers couldn't breach. His Fifth Avenue penthouse, his collection of vintage cars, his priceless art collection featuring works by Monet and Picasso, all gone, sold to private buyers who would probably never know they were purchasing stolen dreams and broken promises. The divorce papers arrived that evening, delivered by a courier who looked embarrassed to be there, as if he understood the cruelty of his mission. Alex was seeking no alimony, claiming no community property, because she'd already taken everything that mattered through legal theft disguised as loving care. That night, alone in a modest two-bedroom apartment in Queens that his remaining assets could barely afford, Landon Donovan stared at the water-stained ceiling and wondered if he should have let Alex Thompson plunge to her death in that silver BMW. At least then he would have died a hero, instead of living as a fool whose love had been weaponized against him with surgical precision. The woman he'd loved enough to sacrifice his mobility for had stolen his dignity, his fortune, and his faith in love itself. She'd left him with nothing but memories of what he'd lost, and the wheelchair that would forever remind him of the price of selfless devotion to someone incapable of returning it. Outside his window, the city hummed its eternal song of ambition and heartbreak, indifferent to one more broken man among its millions of residents, all of them chasing dreams that could disappear in an instant. Chapter 2. The Hollow Crown. Sometimes the deepest wounds are invisible to the naked eye, festering in the darkness where hope used to live. The months that followed Alex's betrayal stretched before Landon Donovan like an endless desert of solitude and regret. Each dawn brought the cruel reminder that yesterday's nightmare was today's reality, and each sunset promised nothing but more of the same hollow existence. His world had contracted to the dimensions of his wheelchair and the suffocating walls of his Queens apartment, where the scent of curry from the Indian restaurant below mingled with the antiseptic smell of his medical supplies. Michael Rodriguez remained his sole connection to the land of the living, arriving each morning at precisely 9 o'clock with the dedication of a monk attending daily prayers. The young man's loyalty burned bright in a world that had grown cold and indifferent, though Landon sometimes wondered if Michael stayed out of pity rather than genuine affection. The thought made him feel even more pathetic than the wheelchair did. The Hartford insurance settlement finally came through, Michael announced one particularly grey morning, setting a steaming cup of coffee within Landon's reach. "It's not the fortune you once commanded," but it's enough to keep the lights on and maintain some dignity. Dignity. The word tasted like ashes in Landon's mouth. What dignity could a man possess when he needed help reaching items on high shelves, when bathroom visits required careful planning, when his entire universe could be measured in wheelchair-accessible square footage? Donovan Industries, once a titan that had employed over 300 people across 7 states, now consisted of exactly 3 individuals working out of a cramped office space that smelled perpetually of the pizza joint next door. The company that had once moved mountains now struggled to move modest consulting contracts across finish lines. Landon's legendary business instincts, sharpened by decades of high-stakes negotiations, had dulled to the point where he could barely summon interest in balance sheets that had once fascinated him. Physical therapy had become a ritualistic form of torture disguised as hope. 3 times weekly, he wheeled himself to the rehabilitation center where Dr. Patricia Williams, a kind woman with prematurely gray hair and infinite patience, guided him through exercises designed to prevent muscle atrophy and maintain what mobility remained to him. "Your upper body strength has improved remarkably," she would encourage, watching him strain to transfer from his wheelchair to the therapy table. "Your attitude is the only obstacle preventing you from achieving real independence." But attitude was precisely the problem that no amount of professional encouragement could solve. How could he summon hope when the woman he'd sacrificed everything for had discarded him like yesterday's newspaper? How could he believe in tomorrow when yesterday had taught him that love was just another word for elaborate exploitation? How could he trust his own judgment when it had led him to ruin so complete that even his enemies would have felt sorry for him? The nights were the worst part of his new existence. In the suffocating darkness of his bedroom, memories played like torture devices, designed by a sadistic deity who enjoyed watching strong men crumble. He remembered Alex's musical laugh, the way she used to trace lazy patterns on his chest with her fingertip, the promises she'd whispered in his ear during their brief reconciliation that now seemed like pure fiction designed to manipulate him into signing away his life's work. Every memory now felt contaminated, poisoned by the knowledge of her true intentions. Had she ever loved him, even in the beginning? Or had she been planning this elaborate con from their very first meeting at that charity gala, where she'd seemed so impressed by his success and generosity? Sleep brought no relief from the psychological torment. His dreams were filled with phantom sensations of legs that no longer responded to his commands, of walking toward a love that evaporated the moment he reached for it with desperate hands. He would wake in cold sweats, his hands instinctively reaching for legs that felt nothing, for a woman who had proven to be nothing more than beautiful smoke with a calculator for a heart. The social isolation was perhaps even more devastating than the financial ruin Alex had orchestrated with such methodical precision. Former friends from his previous life had either disappeared entirely or visited once out of awkward obligation, their discomfort palpable as they struggled to reconcile the powerful man they'd known with the wheelchair-bound shadow he'd become. Their pity was worse than their absence would have been. Christopher Burke, who had once competed aggressively for major contracts with Donovan Industries, now treated him with barely concealed condescension when their paths crossed at business functions Landon could no longer avoid entirely. "Landon, good to see you," Christopher would say with a smile that never reached his eyes. "How are you managing these days?" The emphasis on managing was like a knife twisted in an already infected wound. Social invitations stopped arriving at his mailbox with the abruptness of a faucet being turned off. The charity galas, where he'd once been a major donor and keynote speaker, no longer included his name on their guest lists. Even his doorman, who had once greeted him with respectful enthusiasm and genuine warmth, now offered only perfunctory nods and uncomfortable glances at his wheelchair. The apartment itself had become both sanctuary and prison, a constant reminder of how far he'd fallen from the penthouse heights he'd once taken for granted. Michael had helped him modify it for accessibility, installing grab bars in the bathroom and ramps over every threshold. But each adaptation felt like another concession to his diminished state. The bedroom where he'd once shared passion with Alex now contained only a hospital bed and a collection of medical equipment that reminded him daily of his limitations and dependence. Loneliness became his most faithful companion, more reliable than any friend had ever been. It sat with him during his morning coffee, accompanied him through his afternoon business calls that grew fewer and less important each passing week, and whispered cruel truths in his ear as he lay awake staring at the ceiling that had become his inadvertent confidant. He began to understand why some people in his situation simply gave up entirely, choosing to slip away quietly rather than endure the daily humiliation of existing as a fraction of their former selves. The thought terrified him because of how appealing it sometimes seemed during the darkest hours before dawn. But somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the layers of pain and betrayal that had accumulated like sediment in his soul, a tiny ember of his former self still glowed with stubborn persistence. It was barely visible, nearly extinguished by the hurricane of his circumstances, but it refused to die completely. This ember would prove to be the most important thing Alex Thompson had failed to steal from him in her systematic looting of his life. On particularly difficult days, when the phantom pain in his legs combined with the very real ache in his heart to create an almost unbearable symphony of suffering, Landon would wheel himself to his window and watch the city move below him like a river of ambition and possibility. Millions of people pursuing their dreams, building their lives, falling in love, taking for granted the simple miracle of putting one foot in front of the other without conscious thought. He told himself he hated them for their mobility, their endless options, their blissful ignorance of how quickly everything could change with a single moment of heroic stupidity. But the truth was more complex and painful. He envied them desperately, yes, but he also found himself silently rooting for them to succeed, to love wisely, to appreciate what they had before fate taught them harsh lessons about loss. Their happiness didn't diminish his pain, but it did remind him that joy still existed in the world, even if it felt permanently beyond his reach. Sometimes he would spot couples walking hand in hand, and instead of bitterness, he felt a strange wistfulness for the innocence he'd lost when he learned that love could be a weapon wielded by experts in deception. Michael often found him at this window, lost in contemplation, and wisely chose not to interrupt these moments of reflection. He understood that his employer was fighting a battle far more complex than any hostile corporate takeover he'd ever navigated successfully. This was a war for the very essence of who Landon Donovan could become in the aftermath of devastating loss. The wheelchair had become more than just a mobility device. It was a constant reminder of the moment when everything changed irrevocably. But it was also, though Landon didn't yet realize it, preparing him for a love more profound than any he had ever imagined, a love that would see strength where others saw weakness, beauty where others saw tragedy, and infinite possibilities where others saw only heartbreaking limitations. Chapter 3. An Angel in the Office. Sometimes salvation arrives disguised as coincidence, wearing the face of an angel who doesn't yet know she's been sent to heal a broken soul. The morning Giselle Morgan walked through the frosted glass doors of Donovan Industries' modest Brooklyn office, the very air seemed to shimmer with possibility. Landon Donovan, hunched over quarterly reports that painted a picture of steady decline, didn't even look up when he heard the soft click of heels on the worn linoleum floor. Michael had mentioned interviewing candidates for a new personal assistant, but Landon had given the task only half-hearted attention, assuming it would be another temporary employee who would last a few weeks before finding something better. Then she spoke, and her voice was like warm honey poured over wounded places in his soul. "Mr. Donovan, I'm Giselle Morgan. I believe we have an appointment to discuss the assistant position." When Landon finally raised his eyes from the financial documents, time stopped completely. Before him stood the most breathtakingly beautiful woman he had ever seen, but her beauty wasn't the manufactured perfection of Alex Thompson's surgical enhancements and designer facades. This was natural beauty that radiated from within, skin like polished mahogany that seemed to glow with its own inner light, eyes that sparkled with intelligence and warmth, and a smile that suggested she found genuine joy in simple moments. She wore a modest navy blue dress that had clearly seen better days, paired with shoes that had been resoled more than once. Her purse, though well-maintained, bore the subtle signs of careful use that spoke of someone who made every dollar stretch as far as possible. Yet she carried herself with a dignity and grace that no amount of money could purchase, her posture straight and confident despite what were obviously challenging circumstances. "Please sit down," Landon managed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, watching as she moved with fluid elegance that made even the simple act of sitting seem like poetry in motion. "Thank you for seeing me," Giselle said, folding her hands in her lap with the composure of someone much older than her 26 years. "I know my qualifications might not be exactly what you're looking for, but I'm willing to work harder than anyone else you could hire." Her honesty was refreshing after months of dealing with people who either pitied him or patronized him. There was no uncomfortable avoidance of his wheelchair, no overly cheerful compensation for his obvious disability. She looked directly into his eyes when she spoke, treating him like a man rather than a medical condition that happened to own a business. "Tell me about yourself," Landon said, genuinely curious for the first time in months about another human being's story. Giselle's smile faltered slightly, and he saw a flash of vulnerability that made his chest tighten with unexpected protectiveness. "My father owned a small construction company in Brooklyn," she began, her voice steady despite the pain he could see flickering in her dark eyes. "He borrowed heavily to expand the business, took on projects that were bigger than we could handle. When the economy shifted and several major clients defaulted on their payments, everything collapsed like a house of cards." She paused, gathering strength before continuing. "The debt collectors took our house, our cars, everything we'd worked for. My parents had to move in with my Aunt Jennifer in the Bronx, and the stress of losing everything he'd built gave my father a massive heart attack. He survived, but the medical bills—" She trailed off, the weight of unspoken numbers hanging in the air between them. "So you need this job," Landon said quietly, recognizing the desperation he knew intimately. "Desperately," she admitted without shame. "But I won't take charity, Mr. Donovan. I'll earn every penny you pay me, and I'll do whatever it takes to help your business succeed. I may not have experience as a personal assistant, but I have something more valuable. I understand what it means to lose everything and still keep fighting." The interview was supposed to last 30 minutes. Instead, they talked for 3 hours, conversation flowing between them like water finding its natural course. She asked intelligent questions about his business, offered thoughtful suggestions for improving efficiency, and listened with genuine interest as he explained the challenges of running a company from a wheelchair. But more importantly, she talked to him like a person rather than a victim. When he mentioned the difficulties of accessing certain office areas, she didn't offer sympathy. Instead, she suggested practical solutions. When he referenced his accident, she didn't change the subject uncomfortably. She acknowledged his sacrifice with simple respect. "You saved someone's life," she said, when he reluctantly explained how he'd ended up paralyzed. "That takes the kind of courage most people never have to discover they possess or lack." No one had ever framed his sacrifice in terms of courage before. Alex had called it noble, doctors had called it heroic, but Giselle was the first person to recognize it as a choice that revealed character rather than simply an impulsive moment of romantic foolishness. As the afternoon light shifted through the office windows, painting everything in golden hues that made Giselle's skin glow like burnished copper. Landon found himself studying her face with an artist's attention to detail. She had high cheekbones that spoke of strong ancestry, lips that curved naturally upward, as if smiling was her default expression, and hands that moved gracefully as she spoke, painting pictures in the air to illustrate her points. But it was her eyes that captured him completely. They held depths that suggested a woman who had seen hardship but refused to let it embitter her spirit. When she laughed at something witty, he said, the sound was like music he'd forgotten existed, genuine and infectious in a way that made him want to say clever things just to hear it again. I should probably mention, Giselle said as their conversation wound down, that I don't have a car. I take public transportation everywhere, which means I might occasionally be delayed by subway issues or bus schedules. I hope that won't be a problem. The idea of this remarkable woman cramming herself into overcrowded subway cars twice daily just to work for him made Landon's chest ache with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. We'll provide a car service, he heard himself saying before he'd consciously made the decision. The job requires flexibility, and reliable transportation is a business necessity. Her eyes widened with surprise and gratitude that seemed almost too profound for such a simple gesture. That's incredibly generous, Mr. Donovan. You don't know what that means to my family. When she stood to leave, extending her hand for a professional handshake, the brief contact of skin against skin sent an electric current through Landon's entire body. For just a moment, the numbness that had settled over his life since the accident lifted slightly, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to hope. When can you start? He asked, though he'd already decided to hire her within the first 10 minutes of their conversation. Tomorrow morning, if you'll have me, she replied with a smile that could have powered half of Brooklyn. After she left, the office felt different, brighter somehow, as if her presence had left traces of light lingering in the corners. Michael returned from his lunch break to find Landon actually smiling, the first genuine expression of happiness he'd displayed since Alex's disappearance. I take it the interview went well? Michael asked, settling back into his desk with curiosity written across his features. She's perfect, Landon said simply, the words carrying more weight than a simple employment decision should have warranted. That evening, as he sat in his apartment preparing a simple dinner of pasta and jarred sauce, Landon found himself looking forward to tomorrow for the first time in longer than he could remember. The anticipation felt foreign and slightly frightening, like a muscle he'd forgotten how to use properly. He spent an hour that night researching car services, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to ensure Giselle would have reliable, comfortable transportation. It was a small kindness, but it felt like the first genuinely selfless act he'd performed since his accident, the first time he'd thought about someone else's needs, without calculating what he might gain in return. Outside his window, the city sparkled with its usual indifference, but for the first time since Alex's betrayal, Landon Donovan felt like he might still have a place in its grand design. The ember in his chest, nearly extinguished by months of despair, glowed a little brighter as he contemplated the possibility that salvation might indeed arrive, wearing the face of an angel who needed rescuing just as much as he did. He didn't yet understand that Giselle Morgan would become far more than an employee, that she would prove love could heal even the deepest wounds when offered by hands that had no hidden agenda. He only knew that for the first time since his accident, he was genuinely excited about tomorrow's sunrise. Chapter 4. Love Ignites. When two wounded souls recognize each other across a crowded world, the resulting fire can illuminate even the darkest corners of despair. Giselle Morgan arrived for her first day of work carrying a thermos of coffee that smelled like heaven and a leather portfolio that had clearly been a treasured gift from better times. Landon watched from his office doorway as she moved through the space, transforming the modest Brooklyn office simply by inhabiting it with her graceful presence. She arranged files with the same care other women might use to arrange flowers, turning mundane organization into something almost artistic. "Good morning, Mr. Donovan," she said, turning toward him with a smile that seemed to chase away the perpetual shadows that had settled over his world. "I brought you coffee. I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty of guessing how you might like it prepared." The coffee was perfect, strong enough to wake the dead, but smooth enough to savor, with just a hint of cinnamon that suggested someone who understood that small pleasures could transform ordinary moments into something memorable. As he sipped it, Landon realized he was tasting genuine care for the first time since his accident, care that came without strings attached or ulterior motives lurking beneath the surface. "This is remarkable," he said, and her face lit up with pleasure at his approval. "My grandmother taught me that coffee is love in liquid form," Giselle replied, settling gracefully into the chair across from his desk. "She said if you're going to do something, even something as simple as making coffee, you should do it with your whole heart, or not at all." That philosophy, Landon would soon discover, extended to everything Giselle touched. She answered phones with genuine warmth that made even bill collectors sound less threatening. She organized his schedule with intuitive understanding of his energy levels and limitations. She handled difficult clients with a combination of professionalism and charm that reminded him why he'd once loved the business world. But it was the small kindnesses that gradually began to thaw the ice around his heart. She adjusted the height of his computer monitor without being asked, noticing that he'd been straining his neck. She moved frequently used files to lower drawers he could reach easily. She learned to anticipate his needs, not through pity, but through the kind of attention that spoke of someone who genuinely cared about his comfort and dignity. Within a week, she had become indispensable. Within 2 weeks, she had become the reason he looked forward to coming to work. By the end of the first month, she had become the brightest part of his increasingly complicated emotional landscape. The transformation wasn't just professional. Giselle began staying after normal business hours, not because her duties required it, but because their conversations had a way of extending naturally into the evening. They would discuss everything from market trends to childhood memories, from philosophy to the peculiarities of New York pigeons. She had a way of drawing him out, of making him remember the man he'd been before Alex's betrayal had taught him to guard his heart like a fortress. "You're different when you talk about the early days of your company," she observed one evening as they worked late on a presentation. "Your whole face changes. You light up from the inside." "That was a different man," Landon replied, but without the bitter edge that usually accompanied references to his past. "I don't think so," Giselle said softly, organizing papers with graceful efficiency. "I think that man is still there, just waiting for the right reason to come back to life." The physical therapy sessions became shared adventures rather than solitary struggles when Giselle began accompanying him to the rehabilitation center. She didn't interfere with Dr. Williams's professional guidance, but her presence transformed the sterile medical environment into something that felt almost intimate and hopeful. "You're pushing yourself harder when she's here," Dr. Williams observed with professional satisfaction. "Whatever motivation she's providing, it's working beautifully." Giselle had a way of making his limitations feel less like deficits and more like challenges to overcome together. When he struggled with a particularly difficult transfer exercise, she didn't offer to help immediately. Instead, she waited patiently, ready to assist if needed, but respecting his independence. When he succeeded, her genuine pride and excitement were more rewarding than any trophy he'd ever won. "You're incredible," she said, after watching him complete a complex upper body routine that had taken weeks to master. "The strength you've developed is absolutely amazing." Her admiration felt authentic in a way that made his chest swell with pride he'd thought was gone forever. Alex had praised his business acumen and his wealth, but Giselle praised his character and his determination. The difference was profound and intoxicating. The evening that changed everything began ordinarily enough. They were working late on a proposal for a potential client, the office quiet except for the soft sound of her fingers on the keyboard and the distant hum of Brooklyn traffic below. The presentation was crucial. If they landed this account, it would provide financial stability for several months and perhaps attract other opportunities. Then, the storm arrived with the sudden ferocity that only spring weather in New York could deliver. Rain hammered against the windows like angry fists, and lightning illuminated the office in brilliant, fleeting moments that made everything seem otherworldly. The power flickered once, twice, then died completely, leaving them in darkness broken only by the city lights filtering through the rain-soaked glass. "I don't think we're going anywhere for a while," Giselle said, her voice calm despite the chaos outside. "That rain looks like it plans to stay all night." They sat in the darkness, listening to the storm rage outside, and somehow the loss of electricity had created an intimacy that the bright office lighting had kept at bay. In the shadows, they were just two people sharing space and time, their usual professional boundaries softened by the unusual circumstances. "Are you afraid of storms?" Landon asked, wheeling his chair closer to where she sat. "Not storms," she replied quietly. "I'm afraid of other things, but not weather. My grandmother used to say that storms wash the world clean, make room for new things to grow." They talked through the night as the rain continued its relentless percussion against the windows. She told him about her family's struggles, about watching her proud father struggle to accept charity from relatives, about working 3 jobs before landing this position just to help keep food on the table. He told her about the loneliness that had become his constant companion, about the phantom pain that wasn't really physical, about the way Alex's betrayal had taught him to question every kindness. Somewhere around midnight, exhausted from the emotional honesty they'd shared, Landon complained of tension in his shoulders and neck, a common problem since his accident had changed how he carried himself. Without hesitation, Giselle moved behind his wheelchair and began to massage the tight muscles with hands that seemed to understand exactly where the pain lived. Her touch was electric and healing simultaneously. As her fingers worked magic on muscles that had been knotted with stress for months, Landon felt something inside him crack open, not breaking, but blooming like a flower that had been waiting through a long winter for exactly this moment of tenderness. "Better," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. When he turned his wheelchair to face her, she was closer than either of them had planned. In the dim light filtering through the storm-washed windows, her face was luminous with an emotion that matched what he was feeling. Surprise, desire, and something deeper that neither was quite ready to name. Their first kiss was inevitable and perfect, soft and hesitant, but filled with promise that tasted like hope itself. Her lips were warm and welcoming, and when she didn't pull away immediately, Landon felt like he was drowning in the best possible way. "Giselle," he whispered against her mouth, her name feeling like a prayer on his lips. "I know this is complicated," she murmured back, her forehead resting against his. "I know you're my employer, and I need this job, and there are 100 reasons why this is probably a terrible idea." "But," he prompted, his heart beating so hard he was certain she could hear it. "But I've never felt anything like what I feel when I'm with you," she confessed, her honesty brave and beautiful in the darkness. "You make me want to be stronger, better, more than I ever thought I could be." The confession hung between them like a bridge they could either cross together or burn before it was too late to turn back. Landon reached up to cup her face in his hands, marveling at the softness of her skin and the trust in her eyes. "I love you," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them or dress them up in safer language. I know it's too soon and too complicated and probably insane, but I love you, Giselle. You've brought me back to life when I thought I was finished living." Instead of pulling away or making excuses, she smiled with radiant joy. "I love you too, Landon. I've loved you since that first day when you treated me like I mattered, when you saw potential in me that even I didn't know existed." The moment stretched between them, perfect and fragile as spun glass. Then Landon's expression grew serious, determined. "Marry me, Giselle." Her breath caught in her throat. "Landon, I know about your family's debt," he said gently, his business mind working even as his heart soared. "The medical bills, the failed construction company, the collectors who won't stop calling. Marry me and I'll take care of everything. Your father's treatments, your family's housing, all of it." Tears filled her eyes as the magnitude of his offer sank in. "You would do that? Even knowing that I need this, that my family's survival depends on it?" "Especially knowing that," he replied, bringing her hand to his lips, "because it means you'll stay. It means you'll be mine forever, and I'll be yours. I know you love me, but I also know you're practical. Let me give you both, love and security for everyone you care about." "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying the weight of salvation for her entire family. "Yes, I'll marry you, not just because of what you can provide, but because you're offering it with such generosity. You're saving all of us, and I'll spend my life proving worthy of that gift." The storm raged outside, but inside their small office, something infinitely more powerful was taking root, a love that would prove strong enough to weather any tempest the world could send their way. Chapter 5. Sacred Vows, Cruel Worlds. Love, when it's true, can make a cathedral out of the humblest chapel and turn simple words into eternal promises that echo through heaven itself. The wedding ceremony took place in the intimate garden chapel of St. Mary's Cathedral, where morning sunlight filtered through ancient stained glass windows to paint rainbows across the stone floor. Giselle had chosen the venue not for its grandeur, but for its peaceful beauty and wheelchair accessibility, details that spoke volumes about the woman she was becoming in Landon's life. She walked down the short aisle without a traditional bridal procession, having insisted that their wedding should reflect their reality rather than fairy tale expectations. Her dress was simple but elegant, cream-colored silk that had belonged to her grandmother, altered to fit her perfectly by her own skilled hands. She had pinned her hair up with pearl combs that caught the light, and she carried a small bouquet of white roses that Landon had secretly arranged to be her grandmother's favorite variety. When she reached him at the altar, Landon felt his breath catch in his throat. She was absolutely radiant, glowing with happiness that seemed to emanate from her very soul. As she took his hands in hers, he could feel the slight tremor in her fingers, not from nervousness, but from the overwhelming emotion of the moment. "You look beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with feelings too profound for adequate expression. "You look like the man I want to spend forever loving," she whispered back, her eyes shining with tears of pure joy. Father Martinez, an elderly priest who had known Giselle's family for decades, performed the ceremony with gentle dignity. His words about love, sacrifice and commitment carried special weight as he spoke to a couple who had already proven their understanding of what those concepts truly meant in practice. Giselle's family attended, but their presence was marked more by obligation than celebration. Her mother, Jennifer, sat in the front pew with the expression of someone attending a funeral rather than a wedding, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval that never quite softened into even polite happiness. Her sister Ashley kept checking her phone during the sacred moments, as if the ceremony was an inconvenient interruption to more important matters. Her brother Jacob fidgeted restlessly, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation and probably calculating how long he'd have to stay before he could politely escape. The contrast between their reactions and the genuine joy radiating from the couple at the altar was stark and painful. While Landon and Giselle exchanged vows that brought tears to the eyes of strangers in attendance, her family exchanged meaningful glances that spoke of skepticism and poorly concealed embarrassment. "I take you, Landon, to be my husband," Giselle said, her voice carrying clearly through the chapel despite its softness. "In sickness and in health, in wealth and in poverty, in joy and in sorrow, I promise to love you not despite your challenges, but including them, because they are part of the extraordinary man you are." When it was Landon's turn, his voice broke slightly with emotion. "I take you, Giselle, to be my wife, my partner, and my salvation. You've shown me that love isn't about what we can take from each other, but what we can give. I promise to cherish you, protect you, and love you with every breath I take for as long as my heart continues to beat." The kiss that sealed their marriage was tender and passionate, witnessed by a chapel full of people who understood they were seeing something rare and precious. Two people who had found each other despite impossible circumstances and chosen to build something beautiful together. The reception was small but perfect, held in the chapel's garden where fairy lights twinkled among flowering trees. Giselle had insisted on keeping everything modest, knowing that Landon's reduced circumstances made elaborate celebrations impractical, but what they lacked in luxury, they made up for in genuine warmth and intimate celebration. During their first dance, Giselle swaying gently beside his wheelchair while holding his hands, she whispered secrets in his ear that made him laugh with delight. "I've been practicing this dance for weeks," she confessed. "I wanted our first dance to be perfect, even if it's different from what other couples do." "It is perfect," he assured her, bringing her hand to his lips to kiss her knuckles tenderly. "Everything about you is perfect." Their honeymoon was a long weekend at a charming bed and breakfast in the Hamptons, where the owners had gone out of their way to ensure every accommodation Landon might need. The cottage overlooked the ocean, and they spent hours on the accessible deck, watching waves crash against the shore while wrapped in each other's arms. It was there, in the privacy of their honeymoon suite, that Landon truly understood how completely Giselle loved him. She approached their physical intimacy without hesitation or awkwardness, her touch reverent and passionate as she explored every part of him that could still feel sensation. She made him understand that love transcended physical limitations, that desire could flourish even when circumstances were less than ideal. "You're so beautiful," she murmured against his chest, tracing patterns on his skin with fingertips that left trails of fire in their wake. "Every part of you is beautiful to me." Their lovemaking was tender and explosive, passionate and healing. She showed him that his body, though changed, was still capable of giving and receiving pleasure. In her arms, he felt like a whole man again, desired and cherished for exactly who he was, rather than mourned for who he used to be. "I never knew it could feel like this," he confessed, as they lay intertwined in the afterglow of passion that had exceeded anything he'd experienced with Alex. "I thought this part of my life was over forever." "Nothing about you is over," Giselle whispered, kissing the sensitive spot behind his ear that made him shiver with renewed desire. "We're just beginning our real story together." But their return to reality brought immediate challenges that threatened to poison their newfound happiness. Giselle's family had agreed to move into the renovated mansion that Landon's remaining resources had allowed him to purchase in Westchester, a beautiful but modest home compared to his previous penthouse, but palatial compared to anything her family had known recently. The problems began immediately. Jennifer, Giselle's mother, treated the marriage like a business arrangement that had fortunately worked out in their favor. She walked through the house, evaluating everything with the calculating eye of someone appraising assets rather than appreciating generosity. "This kitchen is smaller than I expected," she announced on their first morning, as if the accommodations were insufficient for her standards, "and that bathroom upstairs needs updating. The fixtures look dated." Ashley, Giselle's younger sister, was even more openly problematic. She flirted outrageously with Landon whenever Giselle left the room, touching his shoulder unnecessarily when she spoke to him, complimenting his appearance in ways that were clearly designed to create tension in his marriage. "You know, Landon," Ashley said one afternoon while Giselle was grocery shopping, perching on the edge of his desk in a way that was clearly inappropriate, "I always wondered what it would be like to be with a successful, sophisticated man like you. Giselle is so lucky." The implications in her tone were unmistakable and deeply uncomfortable. Landon handled the situation with the diplomatic skill that had once made him successful in business. But the incident left him feeling uneasy about the dynamics developing in his own home. Jacob, Giselle's brother, treated the house like a personal ATM machine. He borrowed money from Giselle's purse without asking, used Landon's credit cards for purchases he never discussed, and generally behaved as if marriage to a wealthy man automatically made his sister's resources available for his convenience. "It's just temporary," Giselle would apologize after each incident, clearly mortified by her family's behavior. "They're still adjusting to everything that's happened. They'll learn to respect boundaries." But Landon could see the toll their behavior was taking on his wife. She had always been gracious and patient, but her family's constant demands and lack of gratitude were wearing her down visibly. They excluded her from family conversations while living in her home, criticized her cooking despite eating every meal she prepared, and treated her like a servant who had gotten lucky rather than a woman who deserved respect and appreciation. During family dinners, they would openly discuss Landon's condition as if he wasn't sitting right there at the head of his own table. They questioned whether Giselle was truly happy or just playing a role, suggested she was wasting her youth on a man who couldn't give her children, and generally created an atmosphere of toxicity that poisoned what should have been their honeymoon period. The most painful moment came during a dinner party they hosted for some of Landon's remaining business contacts. Ashley, who had been drinking wine throughout the evening, made a comment that cut deeper than any knife could have. "Everyone's being so polite about this arrangement," she announced to the assembled guests with false cheerfulness. "But let's be honest, my sister is basically a live-in nurse who got lucky enough to marry her patient." The silence that followed was deafening. Landon watched Giselle's face go pale, saw her hands tremble slightly as she reached for her water glass, witnessed the exact moment when humiliation tried to break her spirit. But instead of crumbling, she straightened her shoulders and responded with a dignity that made him fall in love with her all over again. "You're absolutely right, Ashley," Giselle said with a voice like steel wrapped in silk. "I am lucky. I'm lucky to have married a man who values kindness over cynicism, love over convenience, and character over circumstances. Some people spend their whole lives searching for that kind of luck and never find it." That night, after the guests had left and her family had retreated to their rooms with sullen embarrassment, Giselle cried quietly in their bedroom, while Landon held her as tightly as his chair would allow. "I'm so sorry," she whispered against his chest. "They have no right to treat you that way, especially in your own home." "They can't hurt me," Landon said softly, stroking her hair with gentle fingers. "But watching them hurt you is killing me slowly. You deserve so much better than this." "I have better," she replied, looking up at him with eyes that held infinite trust and love. "I have you." Chapter 6. The Fortress of Cruelty. Cruelty, when it wears the mask of family, cuts deepest because it comes from those who should protect the heart they're busy breaking. The poison began to seep through the walls of their Westchester home like toxic smoke, contaminating what should have been their sanctuary with a malevolence that grew stronger each passing day. What had started as mere ungrateful behavior from Giselle's family had evolved into systematic emotional warfare designed to break her spirit and undermine her marriage to the man who had given them shelter when they had nowhere else to turn. Jennifer Morgan, Giselle's mother, had transformed from a grateful refugee into a demanding queen who treated her daughter's home as if it were her personal kingdom. She criticized everything from Giselle's cooking to her choice of household decorations, delivering her complaints with the surgical precision of someone who knew exactly which words would cause the most damage. "This coffee tastes bitter," Jennifer would announce each morning, pushing away the cup that Giselle had prepared with loving care. "Don't you know how to make a proper breakfast? When I was your age, I could prepare a meal that would make any man grateful to come home." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, that Giselle was failing as a wife, that Landon would eventually grow tired of her inadequacies, that her position in this house was temporary at best. Every criticism was designed to plant seeds of doubt about her worth and her future. Ashley, Giselle's younger sister, had elevated flirtation with Landon into an art form that bordered on psychological torture. She would emerge from her bedroom each morning wearing increasingly inappropriate clothing, low-cut tops, short skirts, and perfume applied with heavy hands that announced her presence before she entered a room. Her behavior around Landon was calculated to humiliate Giselle while appearing innocent to casual observers. "Landon, you look so handsome this morning," Ashley would purr, positioning herself where she could touch his shoulder while he worked at his desk. "That shirt brings out your eyes beautifully. You have such striking features, so distinguished and masculine." She would linger beside his wheelchair longer than necessary, lean over him to point at documents on his desk, and find excuses to brush against him that made both Landon and Giselle deeply uncomfortable. When Giselle was present, Ashley would deliver these performances with exaggerated innocence, widening her eyes and speaking in sugary tones that fooled no one. "I'm just being friendly," Ashley would say with mock surprise when Giselle finally confronted her about the inappropriate behavior. "Isn't that what families do? Support each other and show affection. I thought you'd want me to make your husband feel welcome and appreciated." Jacob had turned theft into a casual hobby, treating Giselle's purse and Landon's wallet as community property available for his convenience. Money disappeared regularly. 20s from Giselle's purse, hundreds from Landon's desk drawer, credit cards used for purchases that appeared mysteriously on monthly statements. When confronted, Jacob would offer elaborate explanations that shifted blame away from himself and onto circumstances beyond his control. "I was going to ask permission, but you weren't home and I needed cash for groceries," he would explain with wounded innocence. "I thought we were family now. Isn't that what families do? Help each other out during tough times?" The psychological manipulation was masterful and relentless. They had positioned themselves as the victims of circumstances while casting Giselle as the fortunate daughter who had escaped poverty through advantageous marriage, and should therefore be grateful to support those less lucky. Every request was framed as a reasonable family obligation, every criticism disguised as loving concern for her well-being. But the cruelest treatment was reserved for family gatherings, where Giselle's relatives would arrive and treat her like hired help rather than the lady of the house. They would discuss her marriage as if she weren't present, analyzing her motivations and Landon's condition with the detached interest of medical students examining a fascinating case study. "I wonder how long this will last," her cousin Amanda mused during a birthday celebration for Jennifer, speaking across the dinner table as if Giselle were invisible. "I mean, she's still young and beautiful. Eventually she'll want a normal life with a man who can give her children and take her dancing." "Some people are more practical than others," her Aunt Samantha added with false sympathy. "Giselle always was the smart one in the family. She knows a good situation when she sees it." These conversations happened while Giselle served dinner she had spent hours preparing, while she cleaned up after guests who never offered to help, while she smiled graciously despite the knives being twisted in her back by people who shared her blood. Landon watched these performances with growing admiration for his wife's strength and growing rage at her family's cruelty. The breaking point came during an evening when several of Landon's business associates were invited for dinner, an important occasion that could have led to new contracts and opportunities. Giselle had spent days planning the menu, preparing the house, and ensuring every detail would reflect well on their marriage and Landon's remaining professional reputation. Ashley arrived for dinner wearing a dress that was more appropriate for a nightclub than a family gathering, her makeup applied with theatrical intensity, and her behavior designed to draw attention away from Giselle and toward herself. Throughout the evening, she monopolized conversations with the male guests, laughed too loudly at mediocre jokes, and generally conducted herself like a woman auditioning for the role of hostess rather than playing the part of grateful sister-in-law. The devastating moment came during dessert, when one of the guests complimented Giselle on the beautiful evening she had orchestrated. Ashley, who had been drinking wine throughout dinner, chose that moment to deliver her cruelest blow with surgical precision. "Everyone's being so polite about this whole arrangement," she announced to the assembled guests with false cheerfulness that barely concealed her venom. "But let's be honest about what we're all thinking. My sister is basically a live-in nurse who got lucky enough to marry her patient. I mean, we're all adults here. We can acknowledge reality without pretending this is some great romance novel." The silence that followed was deafening. Crystal glasses stopped midway to lips. Conversation died as if someone had turned off a radio, and every person at the table suddenly found their dessert plates fascinating to study. Landon felt his blood turn to ice as he watched Giselle's face go pale, saw her hands tremble slightly as she reached for her water glass, witnessed the exact moment when humiliation tried to break her spirit in front of people whose respect she had worked so hard to earn. But instead of crumbling under the weight of public embarrassment, Giselle straightened her shoulders and responded with a dignity that made Landon fall in love with her all over again. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was like steel wrapped in silk, strong enough to cut through Ashley's cruelty, but refined enough to maintain her own grace under pressure. "You're absolutely right, Ashley," Giselle said with perfect composure that commanded the attention of everyone present. "I am incredibly lucky. I'm lucky to have married a man who values kindness over cynicism, love over convenience, and character over circumstances. I'm lucky to have found someone who sees strength where others see weakness, who builds people up instead of tearing them down, and who understands that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the quality of love we choose to give and receive." She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering her final, devastating response with the grace of a queen addressing her subjects. Some people spend their entire lives searching for that kind of luck and never find it because they're too busy looking for what they can take instead of what they can give. I feel sorry for anyone who can't recognize genuine love when it's sitting right in front of them. The dinner guests nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by her composure and wisdom. Ashley's face flushed red with embarrassment and rage, but she had been outmaneuvered so completely that any further attacks would only make her look petty and jealous. That night, after the guests had left with promises of future business opportunities and the family had retreated to their rooms with sullen embarrassment, Giselle finally allowed herself to break. She cried quietly in their bedroom while Landon held her as tightly as his wheelchair would allow, his heart breaking for the woman who had defended their love so beautifully while her own family tried to destroy it. "I'm so sorry you had to endure that," he whispered against her hair, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo that had become synonymous with home and safety. "They have no right to treat you that way, especially in our own house." "I can handle their cruelty toward me," she whispered back, her voice muffled against his chest. "But when they disrespect you, when they try to diminish what we have together, it makes me want to fight like a warrior, protecting everything sacred in the world." Chapter 7. Hope. Across the ocean. Love's greatest gifts often come wrapped in sacrifice so profound that angels weep at the beauty of such selfless devotion. The discovery came to Giselle during one of her sleepless nights when she found herself researching spinal cord treatments on her laptop while Landon slept peacefully beside her. She had been conducting these midnight investigations for weeks, driven by a desperate hope that somewhere in the world, someone might hold the key to giving her husband back his mobility. Page after page of medical journals, research papers, and treatment centers filled her browser history as she pursued every lead with the tenacity of a detective solving the case of her life. Dr. Christopher Reynolds of the London Spinal Research Institute appeared on her screen like a miracle wrapped in credentials that took her breath away. His revolutionary stem cell therapy had restored partial mobility to patients doctors had deemed hopeless. The testimonials read like resurrection stories, men and women who had been told they would never walk again, taking their first tentative steps after his experimental treatments. The cost was staggering. $250,000 for the complete treatment protocol, plus living expenses in London for a minimum of 6 months. The amount represented more money than Giselle had ever imagined possessing, more than her entire family had earned in their collective lifetimes. But as she studied the before and after videos of Dr. Reynolds' patients, watching men in wheelchairs gradually progress to walking with assistance, she knew she would find a way. Landon had sacrificed his mobility to save Alex Thompson's worthless life. She would sacrifice everything she owned to give him the chance to reclaim what he had lost in that moment of heroic selflessness. The next morning, while Landon attended a business meeting with Michael, Giselle began the process of liquidating her modest personal assets with the efficiency of a general mobilizing for war. Her grandmother's pearl necklace, the only valuable jewelry she possessed, went to a pawn shop in Manhattan where she accepted far less than its worth without negotiation. Her small savings account, carefully accumulated over years of disciplined spending, was emptied completely. Even her engagement ring, a modest but beautiful piece that Landon had chosen with such care, was quietly sold to a jewelry dealer who promised discretion. The total fell far short of what was needed, but Giselle had learned resourcefulness during her family's financial collapse. She approached Dr. Reynolds' office directly, explaining their situation with the kind of heartfelt honesty that moved even medical professionals accustomed to desperate families. Mrs. Donovan, Dr. Reynolds' assistant Emma Williams said during their transatlantic phone conversation, "The doctor is very moved by your husband's story and your dedication. He's willing to accept partial payment up front with a structured payment plan for the remainder. Your husband's case fits our research parameters perfectly." The treatment was scheduled for late spring, giving them time to prepare both financially and emotionally for the separation that would be required. Giselle presented the opportunity to Landon on their wedding anniversary, wrapping the medical consultation documents in silver paper like the precious gift they represented. "What is this?" Landon asked, his fingers trembling slightly as he unwrapped what he assumed would be some thoughtful but modest anniversary present. "It's hope," Giselle said simply, watching his face as he read Dr. Reynolds' treatment proposal. "It's the chance to give you back what you lost, saving someone who didn't deserve your sacrifice." Landon's reaction was everything she had hoped for and feared simultaneously. Joy, disbelief, gratitude and concern warred across his features as he absorbed the implications of what she had arranged. "Giselle, this must cost a fortune. How did you possibly—" "That doesn't matter," she interrupted gently, kneeling beside his wheelchair to take his hands in hers. "What matters is that you have a chance to walk again, to feel whole again, to reclaim everything that was taken from you." "We can't afford this," he protested, though his eyes were bright with hope he was trying to suppress. "The business is just getting stable, and with your family's expenses." "We'll find a way," she said with conviction that brooked no argument. "I've already spoken with Dr. Reynolds' office. They're willing to work with us on payment arrangements. This is our chance, Landon, our chance to rewrite the ending of this story. The preparations for his departure should have been exciting, filled with anticipation and shared dreams of a future where Landon could stand beside his wife instead of looking up at her from his wheelchair. Instead, they became a battleground where Giselle's family deployed every weapon in their considerable arsenal of manipulation and guilt. The campaign began subtly. Jennifer started experiencing mysterious health problems that required Giselle's constant attention. Headaches that arrived conveniently whenever Giselle tried to research travel arrangements for London, heart palpitations that necessitated emergency visits to doctors who could find nothing wrong, dizzy spells that made her unable to care for herself whenever Giselle mentioned accompanying Landon to England. "I don't know what I'll do without you," Jennifer would moan dramatically, clutching Giselle's hand with theatrical desperation. "You're the only one who knows how to take care of me properly. What if something serious happens while you're gone?" Ashley escalated her inappropriate behavior toward Landon, making it clear that she viewed Giselle's potential absence as an opportunity to pursue her own agenda. She began appearing in the kitchen during his morning coffee routine, wearing nothing but silk robes that revealed far more than they concealed. "Someone needs to take care of you while Giselle is playing nurse to strangers in England," Ashley would say with false concern, positioning herself where he couldn't avoid looking at her. "I've always been better at anticipating men's needs anyway." Jacob contributed to the psychological assault by manufacturing a series of crises that required immediate family intervention. His car broke down and needed expensive repairs that only Giselle could arrange. His job was threatened due to attendance issues that required her to call his supervisor and vouch for his character. His apartment lease was being terminated, necessitating her help in finding new housing and co-signing documents. "Family comes first," Jacob reminded her constantly, his tone suggesting that her marriage was somehow secondary to her obligations to blood relatives who had never shown her the loyalty she was expected to give them. "Landon will understand. Successful men always put business before personal convenience." The most insidious attack came from Austin Butler, the family's lawyer who had been quietly in love with Giselle since long before her marriage to Landon. Austin had positioned himself as the voice of reason, the concerned friend who only wanted what was best for everyone involved. "Are you sure about this England plan?" Austin asked during one of his increasingly frequent visits to their home, always timing his arrival for moments when Landon was away at physical therapy. 6 months is a long time to be apart from your husband, especially when your marriage is still so new, and his condition makes him emotionally vulnerable. Austin was handsome in a conventional way that attracted women who valued security over passion. His success as a lawyer had provided him with the kind of comfortable lifestyle that looked appealing from the outside, and he was skilled at presenting himself as the safer alternative to a complicated marriage with a disabled man. "Landon needs you here," Austin continued, moving closer to where Giselle sat, reviewing treatment protocols. "What if the therapy doesn't work? What if he comes back disappointed and needs emotional support? Are you really going to abandon him during the most crucial period of his recovery?" The manipulation was subtle but effective, designed to make Giselle question her own motivations and feel guilty for wanting to support her husband's healing journey. Austin knew exactly which buttons to push, which fears to amplify, which doubts to nurture until they grew into paralyzing uncertainty. The final assault came the night before Landon's scheduled departure. Jennifer collapsed dramatically in the kitchen, clutching her chest and gasping for breath with theatrical intensity that would have impressed Broadway audiences. The ambulance arrived with sirens wailing, neighbors gathered on the lawn with concerned expressions, and chaos descended on their home like a plague of locusts. "I can't breathe," Jennifer wheezed from her hospital bed, gripping Giselle's hand with surprising strength for someone supposedly dying. "The doctors say it could be my heart. They want to run tests, keep me for observation. I'm so scared, sweetheart. I need you here with me." Ashley and Jacob flanked their mother's bed like bodyguards protecting a wounded general, their faces masks of concern that barely concealed their satisfaction at the perfectly timed crisis. "Mom needs you now," Ashley insisted, her voice trembling with artificial emotion. "Landon will understand. Family has to come first during medical emergencies." Austin appeared at the hospital as if by magic, his presence coincidental but convenient. "This is clearly a sign," he said quietly to Giselle, while her family monopolized the doctor's attention. "Maybe you're not supposed to go to England. Maybe this is the universe's way of telling you where you really belong." The pressure was overwhelming, coming from every direction simultaneously. Guilt, fear, family obligation, and romantic manipulation combined into a perfect storm designed to keep Giselle from accompanying the man she loved on the most important journey of his recovery. Standing in their bedroom that night, watching Landon pack his few belongings with quiet determination, despite his obvious disappointment at the prospect of traveling alone, Giselle felt her heart breaking into pieces that might never fit back together properly. "You have to go," she whispered, though every fiber of her being wanted to climb onto that plane beside him. "Dr. Reynolds is expecting you, and this opportunity might not come again." "Not without you," Landon replied firmly, though she could see the hope dying in his eyes. "We're partners in everything, Giselle. I won't leave you to deal with this crisis alone." But they both knew he had to go. The appointment with Dr. Reynolds had been scheduled months in advance, the partial payment had been made, and delaying might mean losing the opportunity entirely. Sometimes love meant making impossible choices that destroyed you in order to save the person you loved most. Their goodbye at JFK Airport was agonizing and beautiful, a scene of love so profound that strangers stopped to watch with tears in their eyes, recognizing they were witnessing something rare and precious. Chapter 8. Exile and Grief. Sometimes the cruelest exile comes not from strangers, but from those who share your blood and should have shared your burdens instead. The moment Landon's plane disappeared into the Atlantic sky, Giselle's family dropped their masks of concern with the efficiency of actors leaving a stage after the final curtain call. The manufactured medical emergency that had kept her from accompanying her husband evaporated as quickly as morning mist under a harsh sun, leaving behind only the bitter taste of manipulation and the devastating realization that she had been played like a violin by virtuoso performers. Jennifer Morgan's miraculous recovery began before the hospital discharge papers were even signed. Her chest pains vanished, her breathing normalized, and her energy returned with suspicious vigor that made the attending physicians scratch their heads in professional bewilderment. "Sometimes stress manifests in mysterious ways," the doctor explained with a shrug, unwilling to suggest that a patient might have fabricated symptoms for personal gain. But Giselle knew the truth, and the knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone made of betrayal and regret. The attack on her marriage began within hours of Landon's departure. Ashley wasted no time moving into the master bedroom suite, claiming that the larger space was better suited to her needs than the guest room she had been occupying. She redecorated with items purchased using credit cards that bore Landon's name, transforming the intimate sanctuary where Giselle and her husband had shared their most precious moments into something that looked like a magazine spread designed to impress men rather than comfort wives. "Landon won't mind," Ashley declared with false innocence when Giselle protested the unauthorized changes. "He's not here to use it anyway, and someone should get some enjoyment out of all this luxury while it lasts." Jacob elevated his theft from opportunistic grabbing to systematic looting, treating Landon's absence as an invitation to help himself to whatever caught his fancy. Electronics disappeared from the den, expensive wine vanished from the cellar, and even Landon's collection of rare books began to thin as Jacob discovered their value in online marketplaces. "I'm just borrowing some things temporarily," he explained when confronted with evidence of his systematic pillaging. "It's not like Landon is using any of this stuff right now. I'll put everything back before he returns from his vacation." Vacation. As if her husband's desperate quest for healing was some sort of luxury pleasure trip, rather than a last-ditch effort to reclaim the mobility stolen from him by his own heroic nature. But the cruelest blow came when Jennifer gathered the family for what she called an important meeting about their living situation. They assembled in the drawing room like a tribunal preparing to render judgment, with Giselle as the unwilling defendant in a trial where the verdict had been predetermined. "We've been discussing the situation," Jennifer announced with the authority of someone delivering divine proclamation, "and we've decided that it's best for everyone if you find your own place while Landon is away." The words hit Giselle like physical blows, each syllable designed to cause maximum damage to her sense of security and belonging. "This is my home," she said quietly, though her voice trembled with the effort of maintaining composure. "Landon and I live here together." "Landon isn't here," Ashley pointed out with vicious satisfaction, examining her manicured nails as if the conversation bored her. "And honestly, we're not sure he's coming back at all. England has excellent medical facilities and social services for people in his condition. He might decide to stay permanently." The implication was clear. They were betting that Landon would abandon his wife permanently, leaving them free to claim the house and whatever assets remained. It was a gamble that revealed the depth of their callousness and their complete misunderstanding of the man Giselle had married. "You have until the end of the week," Jacob added, with the casual cruelty of someone evicting a tenant rather than exiling a family member. "We'll pack your things for you if you're not here to do it yourself." The eviction was swift and merciless. Giselle found herself standing on the front steps of what had been her home, holding 2 suitcases that contained the remnants of her life, watching her own family close the door in her face without backward glances or second thoughts. Austin Butler appeared within hours, as if he had been waiting in the wings for exactly this moment of vulnerability. His black Mercedes pulled into the driveway where Giselle sat on her suitcases, trying to process the magnitude of her family's betrayal while figuring out where she could possibly go with no resources and no support system. "Giselle, what's happened here?" Austin asked with perfectly calibrated concern, emerging from his car like a knight arriving to rescue a damsel in distress. "Why are you sitting outside with luggage?" His shock seemed genuine, though Giselle suspected he had orchestrated her family's timing with the skill of a conductor leading a symphony of manipulation. "They've asked me to leave," she said simply, too exhausted by betrayal to elaborate on the details. "That's unconscionable," Austin declared with righteous indignation that might have been convincing if she hadn't learned to recognize performance from her family's recent theatrical displays. "You can't stay on the street. Come stay with me until we figure out a permanent solution." His apartment in Manhattan was beautiful, expensive, and completely inappropriate for a married woman whose husband was fighting for recovery on another continent. But with nowhere else to turn and no money for hotel rooms, Giselle found herself accepting charity from a man whose intentions she neither trusted nor welcomed. Austin's campaign for her affections began immediately. He filled his apartment with flowers she didn't want, prepared elaborate meals she couldn't appreciate, and spoke constantly about how much better her life could be if she would only admit that her marriage had been a mistake born of desperation rather than love. "Landon is a good man," Austin said over dinner she had barely touched, "but you're young and beautiful. You deserve a partner who can give you everything: children, travel, a normal life where you're not defined by someone else's limitations." "Landon doesn't limit me," Giselle replied with quiet firmness. "He inspires me to be stronger than I ever thought possible." But Austin was patient and persistent, wearing down her resistance with daily reminders of what she was missing, what she could have, what she deserved as a woman in the prime of her life. His arguments were seductive, precisely because they contained grains of truth wrapped in poison that was designed to corrupt her loyalty from within. The crushing blow that nearly broke her spirit entirely came when Jennifer called with news that her mother was seriously ill. "She's been asking for you," Jennifer said with tears in her voice that sounded genuine for once. "The doctors say it might be cancer. She wants to see you before it's too late." Giselle rushed to the Bronx, using her last available credit to pay for a taxi that delivered her to a rundown apartment where her mother lay dying with the same dramatic flair she had brought to every crisis in her life. But this time, the drama was real, the illness genuine, and the need for care authentic rather than manufactured. For weeks, Giselle nursed her mother with devotion that should have inspired gratitude, but instead became another weapon for her family to use against her. They demanded she pay for experimental treatments they couldn't afford, medicine that might ease suffering, private nurses when she needed to sleep. Every dollar she had saved for emergencies disappeared into the bottomless pit of medical expenses. Her phone service was disconnected when she couldn't pay the bill. Her credit cards reached their limits and beyond. She sold her wedding ring to pay for morphine that would ease her mother's final days, watching the symbol of Landon's love disappear into the hands of a pawnbroker who didn't understand its true value. When her mother died, Jennifer Morgan's final words were not gratitude for her daughter's sacrifice, but accusation wrapped in dying breath. "You brought bad luck into this family," she whispered with her last strength. "Marrying that broken man cursed us all." Even in death, her mother's cruelty found ways to wound. The funeral expenses fell entirely on Giselle's shoulders, while her siblings contributed nothing but criticism of the modest arrangements she could afford. They blamed her for their mother's death, suggested that stress over Giselle's marriage had accelerated the illness, and made it clear that she was no longer welcome among them, even in grief. With her phone disconnected and no money for international calls, Giselle had no way to contact Landon in England. She didn't even know if his treatment was successful, if he was recovering, if he still loved her, or had been convinced by distance and time that Austin Butler was right about their marriage being a mistake. In a studio apartment in Queens that cost more than she could afford, but was all that was available on short notice, Giselle spent her nights writing letters to her husband that she had no way to send. Page after page of love, longing, and unwavering faith filled notebooks that became her only confidence in a world that had suddenly become hostile and cold. But her love for Landon never wavered, not even when the walls closed in and hope seemed as distant as the stars that twinkled mockingly outside her single window. Chapter 9. The lie's unraveled truth has its own heartbeat, and lies, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually crumble under the weight of their own deception. Landon Donovan's return to New York after 6 months in London should have been triumphant. Dr. Christopher Reynolds' revolutionary treatment had worked beyond their wildest expectations. Not a complete cure, but miraculous progress that had restored feeling and limited movement to his legs. He could stand with assistance, take halting steps with the support of specialized braces, and most importantly, he had hope burning in his chest like a flame that could light up the entire world. The plane touched down at JFK with a gentle bump that felt like a kiss from destiny itself. Landon's hands shook with anticipation as he maneuvered his wheelchair through the terminal, his heart racing with excitement at the thought of surprising Giselle with his progress. He imagined the look on her face when he stood up to greet her, the tears of joy they would share, the celebration that would mark the beginning of their new life together. But the house in Westchester was not the sanctuary he remembered. His key still worked, but everything inside felt wrong. Furniture rearranged, personal items missing, and an atmosphere of occupancy without ownership that set his nerves on edge immediately. His wheelchair moved through rooms that should have welcomed him home, but instead felt like a stage set arranged by people who didn't understand the script. "Giselle?" he called out, his voice echoing through the halls with an emptiness that made his stomach clench with sudden dread. "Giselle, I'm home." Jennifer appeared at the top of the staircase, like a queen surveying her domain, her expression carefully arranged into a mask of surprise and concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Landon, you're back early. We weren't expecting you until next week." The casual possessiveness in her tone, "we," instead of Giselle and I, sent warning signals through his consciousness like alarms in a burning building. "Where is my wife?" he asked, his business instincts suddenly alert to danger he couldn't yet identify. Ashley emerged from what had been his and Giselle's bedroom, wearing one of Giselle's robes as if it belonged to her, her hair tousled in a way that suggested she had been sleeping in his marital bed. The sight hit him like a physical blow, though he couldn't yet understand why everything felt so fundamentally wrong. "Oh, Landon," Ashley said with theatrical sadness that would have been laughable if it weren't so obviously rehearsed. "I'm so sorry you had to come back to this. We didn't know how to tell you while you were receiving treatment." Jacob appeared from the kitchen, carrying a beer that had come from Landon's personal stock, his casual appropriation of hospitality, another piece of evidence that something catastrophic had occurred in his absence. The three family members positioned themselves like a tribunal, preparing to deliver devastating news to a man they clearly viewed as a victim rather than the master of his own house. "Tell me what?" Landon demanded, though part of him already suspected the answer would destroy whatever happiness his medical progress had provided. "Giselle left," Jennifer said, with the practiced delivery of someone who had rehearsed this moment multiple times. She couldn't handle the pressure anymore. The marriage, your condition, the financial stress, it all became too much for her to bear. The words hit him like sledgehammer blows, each syllable designed to shatter his newly rebuilt confidence and hope. "That's impossible," he said, though his voice lacked conviction even to his own ears. "She would never leave without telling me. She would never abandon our marriage like that." Ashley moved closer, her expression a masterful blend of sympathy and satisfaction. "She tried to make it work, Landon. We all saw how hard she tried. But she's young and she has needs that you couldn't meet. She deserves a chance at real happiness with someone who can give her everything." "Where did she go?" Landon asked, his heart pounding against his ribs like a caged animal desperate for escape. Jacob stepped forward with documents that looked official and damning. "She left with Austin Butler," he said, producing photographs that showed Giselle and Austin entering a restaurant together, walking down a street side by side, sitting in his car outside what appeared to be a hotel. "They've been seeing each other since before you left for England. We tried to talk her out of it, but she said she couldn't live a lie anymore." The photographs were cleverly staged and professionally shot, showing moments that could be interpreted as romantic, but were actually Austin's patient manipulation, captured by a private investigator he had hired to create exactly this false narrative. Giselle's face in the images showed stress and exhaustion rather than romantic happiness, but grief and shock made Landon unable to read the subtle signs that might have revealed the truth. "She asked us to give you this," Jennifer said, producing a letter written on Giselle's personal stationery that bore her signature but felt wrong in ways Landon couldn't immediately identify. The handwriting was correct, but the words were poison disguised as explanation. "My dearest Landon," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I will be gone. I tried to love you the way you deserve, but I cannot continue living a lie. Austin has shown me what real love feels like, what it means to be with a man who can give me everything I've always dreamed of having. I hope your treatment was successful and that you can forgive me for not being strong enough to keep pretending. I wish you nothing but happiness in your new life. Giselle." Each word was a knife twisted in his chest, but something about the letter felt fundamentally wrong. This wasn't the voice of the woman who had sacrificed her grandmother's pearls to fund his treatment, who had defended their love against Ashley's cruelty with the dignity of a queen, who had kissed him goodbye at the airport with tears streaming down her face and promises of eternal devotion on her lips. "I don't believe this," Landon said, though his conviction was cracking under the weight of evidence that seemed overwhelming in its completeness. "Believe it or don't," Ashley replied with a shrug that suggested his denial was pathetic rather than reasonable. "She made her choice, Landon. Austin can give her children, take her dancing, provide the kind of normal life she deserves. You should be grateful she had the courage to be honest, instead of staying out of pity." The family closed ranks around their fabricated narrative with the efficiency of experienced conspirators. They had answers for every question, explanations for every doubt, and evidence to support their claims that Giselle had been planning her escape since before Landon's departure for England. But they had underestimated the man they were trying to deceive. Landon Donovan hadn't built a multi-million-dollar empire by accepting surface explanations when deeper investigation was warranted. His business instincts, sharpened by decades of detecting fraud and manipulation in corporate negotiations, began to identify inconsistencies in their story that didn't align with the woman he knew his wife to be. The first crack in their carefully constructed lie came from Daniel Thompson, the elderly groundskeeper who had maintained the property since before Landon's purchase. Daniel was an honest man who lived in a small cottage on the estate's grounds and observed everything with the patient attention of someone who had learned that watching quietly often revealed more truth than asking direct questions. "Mr. Donovan," Daniel said quietly, when he found Landon alone in the garden where he often went to think and remember happier times, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but something feels wrong about this whole situation with Mrs. Donovan." Landon looked up sharply, his heart suddenly beating faster with the first hint that his instincts might be correct. "What do you mean, Daniel?" "That young lady loved you something fierce," Daniel said, his weathered hands working nervously with the gardening tools he carried. "I seen the way she looked at you, heard her on the phone making arrangements for your treatment. That wasn't no woman planning to run off with another man." The old groundskeeper's simple observation planted a seed of doubt that began growing immediately into full-scale investigation. If Giselle hadn't left willingly, if her family was lying about Austin Butler, then where was his wife, and why were they so determined to convince him she was gone forever? That evening, Landon began searching through the house with the methodical precision of a detective gathering evidence. Financial records showed irregularities in spending patterns that suggested systematic theft rather than normal household expenses. Credit card statements revealed purchases his wife would never have made, expensive jewelry, designer clothes, electronic equipment that had never appeared in their home. The telephone records told an even more interesting story. Giselle's phone had been disconnected weeks before her supposed departure with Austin Butler, yet the family claimed to have been in regular contact with her during her alleged affair. The timeline didn't match their narrative, and the inconsistencies multiplied the more closely he examined their claims. Chapter 10. Love's True Victory. When love is real, it finds its way home through any darkness, over any obstacle, past any lie designed to keep hearts apart. The brownstone in Brooklyn, where Giselle's mother had lived before the family's financial collapse, stood like a forgotten monument to better times. Landon sat in his specially equipped car outside the modest building, his heart hammering against his ribs as he gathered courage for what might be the most important conversation of his life. Daniel's quiet certainty that something was wrong had sent him searching through every place Giselle might seek refuge, and this house, now empty and scheduled for demolition, was the only sanctuary left that made sense. He found her in the small backyard garden, kneeling beside a freshly tended grave, marked with a simple stone that bore her mother's name. She looked heartbreakingly thin, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had clearly missed too many meals, but even in grief and poverty, she was the most beautiful sight he had ever witnessed. "Giselle," he whispered, his voice carrying across the garden like a prayer finally answered. She turned toward him with eyes that widened in shock, disbelief, and then overwhelming joy that transformed her face from sorrow into radiance. "Landon, is it really you?" Their reunion was explosive. Tears, desperate embraces, and passionate kisses that tasted like coming home after the longest exile imaginable. She threw herself into his arms with such force that his wheelchair rocked backward, but he held her tight against his chest as if he would never let her go again. "They told me you left with Austin Butler," he said between kisses that couldn't bridge the months of separation fast enough. "They showed me photographs, letters, evidence that you didn't love me anymore." "All lies," she sobbed against his neck, her tears hot against his skin. "They threw me out the day you left for England. Everything they told you was fabricated to keep us apart." The truth spilled out between them like water from a broken dam. Her mother's real illness and death, her family's systematic cruelty, Austin Butler's relentless pursuit disguised as friendship, the financial ruin that had forced her to sell even her wedding ring to survive. Landon listened with growing rage at the people who had tortured the woman he loved, while he was fighting to heal himself for their future together. "I knew something was wrong," he said, cupping her face in his hands to study every beloved feature he had missed, like physical pain. "My heart knew you would never abandon us willingly." "Never," she whispered fiercely. "I would die before I would betray what we have together." That night, in the empty house where her mother had raised her, they made love with desperate passion that erased months of separation and lies. Giselle traced the muscles he had rebuilt in England, marveled at the progress he had made, and showed him that her desire had only grown stronger during their forced-apart time. "You can feel this?" she whispered, touching his legs with reverent fingers, as sensation sparked through nerve pathways that Dr. Reynolds had helped repair. "Everything," he gasped, overwhelmed by physical pleasure he had thought was lost forever. "I can feel everything you're doing to me." Their lovemaking was healing and transcendent, a reclamation of intimacy that had been stolen by lies and manipulation. In her arms, Landon felt complete again, not just physically, but spiritually and emotionally whole in ways that had nothing to do with his medical recovery. The next morning they returned to Westchester together. Giselle had transformed during their separation from a gentle woman into a force of nature who would not be intimidated or manipulated ever again. She walked into her own home with the bearing of a queen reclaiming her rightful throne, Landon beside her like a king who had returned from victorious battle. Her family's shock at seeing them together was delicious to witness. Jennifer dropped the crystal glass she had been holding. Ashley's face went white with panic, and Jacob literally backed away, as if confronting ghosts who had returned to haunt their guilty consciences. "Hello, family," Giselle said with silk-wrapped steel in her voice. "I believe you have some explaining to do." The confrontation was swift and final. Faced with Landon's evidence of their theft and lies, her family had no defense except weak denials that convinced no one. But instead of demanding justice or revenge, Giselle chose a different path that revealed the true nobility of her character. "I forgive you," she said simply, though her forgiveness came with conditions that were not negotiable. "But you will leave this house immediately and never contact us again. You chose to betray family love for temporary convenience. Live with that choice." Their exile was as swift as her own had been, but deserved rather than cruel. Driving through Manhattan that evening, celebrating their reunion with dinner at a restaurant that accommodated Landon's wheelchair, they spotted a familiar figure on a street corner that made both of them freeze in recognition. Alex Thompson sat slumped against a building wall, clearly intoxicated, holding a cardboard sign that begged for spare change from passers-by who avoided eye contact with practiced city indifference. Her designer clothes had been replaced with thrift store finds, her perfect hair hung in unwashed tangles, and her face bore the ravages of addiction and desperation. "Should we stop?" Giselle asked quietly, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "No," Landon replied, pressing the accelerator to carry them past the wreckage of his former life. "Some people create their own justice." They drove home in comfortable silence, hands entwined, hearts finally at peace after surviving storms that had tested every aspect of their love and found it unbreakable. The house welcomed them back like old friends, and they spent the evening planning modifications that would accommodate Landon's improving mobility while creating the family sanctuary they had always dreamed of building together. Later, as they prepared for bed in their reclaimed bedroom, Giselle moved around their space with graceful efficiency, unpacking the few belongings she had managed to keep during her exile. The simple domesticity of the moment felt profound after everything they had endured to reach this point of peaceful togetherness. "I have something to tell you," she said with a mysterious smile that made his heart race with anticipation rather than dread for the first time in longer than he could remember. Before she could continue, a gentle knock echoed through the house from their front door. They looked at each other with curiosity and mild annoyance at the interruption of their private reunion celebration. Who could that be at this hour? Landon wondered aloud, glancing at the clock that showed nearly midnight. Giselle's response was musical laughter that filled their bedroom with joy so pure it seemed to chase away every shadow that had ever threatened their happiness. The sound was like silver bells ringing in celebration, like champagne bubbles rising toward heaven, like the first notes of a symphony that promised wonderful surprises yet to come. "I guess we'll have to answer it to find out," she said, her laughter continuing as she moved toward the door with dancing steps that suggested she knew exactly who was waiting on the other side with news that would change their lives forever.